Welcome to this final session of the John P. Redmond Health and Safety Symposium and the Dominic F. Barbera EMS Conference. And in this final live webinar on stored energy systems. My name is Jim Brinkley, and I have the pleasure of serving as the IFF Director of Occupational Health and Safety, led by an incredible staff, including Pat Morrison, who's the Assistant to the General President for Health, Safety, and Medicine. It's our responsibility to look at emerging threats and make sure that you have the training, the protocols, and resources you need to deal with those. One of those emerging threats is an energy crisis that we're all going to have to deal with and will impact your health and safety directly. A recent study projected a 2.4 gigawatt shortfall in energy in the Midwest by as early as next year. So what does that really mean to you? It means about 2 million homes won't have power. You think about that, an energy shortfall that puts 2 million homes in the dark. So the result of that is a lot of emerging technology to provide alternative energy sources. There's a widening gap between the energy we have and the energy we need. How do we deal with that crisis? What systems are in place to help bridge that gap? These will create new challenges. It's going to mean you changing your protocols for fighting fires, the way you attack these different systems. The hazards that are present need to be dealt with in new ways, unconventional ways. So what we've done is put together a panel of experts here to walk us through what some of those dangers are and some of the things you can do to mitigate those dangers. First, on my left, joining us to discuss these threats is Paul Rogers. Paul is a lieutenant with FDNY and a member of IFF Local 854. Paul's working with NFPA and FDNY command staff to safely guide battery manufacturers with the proper installation of energy storage systems within New York City. He has worked to develop training, guidelines, and other resources for firefighters so that they can safely deal with stored energy emergencies. On my immediate right is Sean DeCrane. Sean DeCrane is from Underwriter Laboratories. Prior to joining UL, Sean retired as a battalion chief with more than 25 years with the Cleveland Division of Fire. He rose through the ranks and also served as Director of Training and Acting Chief of Operations. He has been very involved in research with UL and NIST in the United States, and has also served as the primary representative for the IFF on standards development for many years. And to Sean's right, we have Tony Granato. Tony is a lieutenant with the Manchester Fire and Rescue EMS and a member of IFF Local 1579. Tony serves as an instructor for the solar safety training developed for firefighters with IFF in collaboration with the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, or IREC. Welcome to all of you. Now, we've all heard the term energy storage systems, or ESS. Paul, let me start with you. What does the ESS mean? What is an energy storage system at a high level?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jim. You know, I've been working on this project for about 4 years now, and a couple of guys in my department have been saying to me, you know, Paul, what is an energy storage system? And I give them this whole elaborate answer about, well, it's got this, and it's very technical, and all these different things. And then the guy looks at me and he says, you know, I'm a firefighter. Can you just dumb it down that I can understand it? So I said, okay, that's fine. And he's right? We need to make sure that we can have everyone understand that. So think of a rechargeable battery, all right, where it's going to charge and discharge back and forth constantly. These things are going to be powered by the electrical grid. It could be powered by solar. It could be powered by wind. Another way to look at it is a cell phone, right? The cell phone has a battery in it, correct? If you look at your cell phone, you charge that cell phone, that battery is actually becoming the energy storage for that phone. These energy storage systems that we are going to see out there in the field that are going to be challenging for us are going to be powering buildings. We're talking high-rise buildings, manufacturing buildings, utility scale size energy storage systems, and also even in the private dwellings, we'll see them. So they'll be proliferating, and there's a tremendous amount of energy as opposed to what we have the energy stored inside here. So you'll be dealing with a tremendous amount of energy.
So we'll see them in all of these different applications. What type of systems are out there? I assume there are different types.
Well, there is. There's a, energy storage is not new. It's actually been around for a while. We started it with pumped hydro, and as you can see on the screen there, you have a reservoir that's on top of a mountain, and then you have another reservoir below. So as that water falls through, that's creating energy, right? It's creating energy in the generators, and it's producing that energy during peak hours of the day. Then during the non-peak hours of the day, what they'll do is they'll pump that water back up from the reservoir down below, and they'll pump it back up, and then they'll reuse it and recycle it like that. So that's just one of them. There's other ones that are out there that you may see, like a flywheel is something that's also out there. I've been lucky to see a couple of these things. What they're doing is they're taking the rotation inertia from the flywheel itself, storing that energy, and I've seen these connected to, believe it or not, elevator systems. So the elevator moving up and down will actually have some sort of energy, and will be able to turn that flywheel for that stored energy in that sense. Another one that we have seen out there, and I was witness to this, and I thought this was kind of interesting, is a thermal type of stored energy. So there's some places in Manhattan that produce ice at night. So they'll produce that ice at night, they'll store that ice, and then they'll use that cold air during the day instead of turning on compressors, which will reduce their electrical footprint that they're going to need during the day. So that's considered some sort of energy storage. And then you have ones like compressed air. Now, I have not witnessed it, but I know it's out there. I'm just curious if anyone here on the panel has seen them. But these ones, what they'll do is they'll compress the air at night, and then they'll release that air during the day, again, turning a generator and then creating energy. And then we have these other ones. These ones here are your electrochemical. These are the ones that's going to start to cause us some issues, all right? These are the ones that are on the horizon that are coming our way. There are some that are out there. The one that you see on your screen there is the sulfur sodium. So these are quite prevalent in Japan, and I think there are a couple here in the United States, and I'm not sure about Canada, but they are out there. And this is elemental sodium, and it's at a very, very high temperature. It operates at a very, very high temperature, and these things will react if you hit them with water. What you have now in front of you is a lead acid type, all right? These lead acid are just like your car batteries, and these things are used in the telecom world. These lead acid batteries are very stable. They're pretty good. They've been around for a long time. They're also used in the UPS systems, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. But the lead acid have been out there for a while. Also, you have these flow batteries. These flow batteries have two types of liquids, all right? The liquids are in two tanks, and what they'll do is they'll pump that liquid through the tanks, and there's a membrane separating it. And then as a result of that pumping, they'll actually get some energy out of that. These things are very stable. We in New York City actually approved a flow battery on the 25th floor of a setback. Now, there's reasons why we did that, but you have basically all this electrolyte or corrosive material on the 25th floor of an office high-rise building. The reason that you would use these is that they last a very, very long time. So these flow batteries are also something you may see on the horizon. And then we have this one here. This is the lithium ion, okay? The lithium ion is the one that's going to be leading the industry. This one here is relatively new in the field, and this one may cause some issues if not handled properly. We're going to see these things proliferate throughout the United States. And then also, nickel cad has been around for a while. We're going to start to see these things start phasing out as these other new technologies, emerging technologies, start to replace them.
So a number of different types, but what are their uses? You mentioned uninterrupted power supply is one use. What other uses are there?
Well, yeah, let's take a look at some of the uses. So we have emergency backup systems, all right? The emergency backup systems in the buildings, like if the grid were to go down, we still need to have power for the exit lights or the fire alarms in there. So those emergency backup systems have that stored energy, and in some cases, they have a lot of stored energy. We see them usually in a lead acid base. Eventually, we're looking for them to gravitate over to the lithium ion. Also, we mentioned the UPS system. The UPS system is the uninterrupted power supply. We find them in financial districts. I've been on a couple of calls where we've had some overheated batteries in the UPS system, and we go to shut those things down, and building personnel will tell you not to shut them down unless they're on fire. Just having a overheated battery does not constitute shutting those things down. Because if you were to shut it down and the building were to lose power, you could lose billions of dollars of data. So those things are only going to be used if the building energy goes down, and it's only going to serve a gap between the building energy going down and the generator kicking on. So it serves that tiny little gap, because if the electricity goes down inside a building, the generator just doesn't kick on. There's a little bit of a delay or a gap. So that's what the UPS covers, just that gap alone in that area. We also see the peak shaving, and that's where these energy storage systems are really going to start to proliferate. Peak shaving is really just trying to level out that peaks inside the energy usage. During the daytime, when everyone is waking up, we see a tremendous spike in the energy. So what they're looking to do is they're looking to use these batteries, store that energy inside the batteries, and then during peak hours of the day, release that energy so we can bring down that spike. Because at night, the energy is not being used, so some of it is getting wasted. So peak energy is, peak shaving is one of the things that we are going to see. And also load shifting. So you may have a certain area in your municipality that is using a tremendous amount of energy in that particular time, and what they'll do is they'll start to pump a tremendous amount of energy through there, and you'll have a lot of transformer fires. So instead of pumping all that energy through the transformer, they're going to start using batteries in order to actually shift that load to the batteries. Those type of systems, as opposed to the UPS systems and the emerging backup systems, which are only going to be cycled in an emergency when the grid goes down. But these new ones, these peak shaving and and the load demand, they'll be cycled every day. And these things are going to be using lithium ion, which is a very dense energy. And we're looking at, as they start to get used more and more frequently, we're looking at potential problems. We don't know yet, because there's not a lot of work in the industry on these right now.
That's a great foundation, and I didn't realize the difference in the terms until you explained it that way. I want to go back to what we've all seen in the news lately. And Sean, I'll turn to you for this one. Lithium ion batteries. Every day it seems like on the news we're watching another video of someone being hurt by a lithium ion battery issue. How are these different, or how do they play into the energy storage systems?
Thanks, James. Well, the lithium ion batteries that we see in these consumer products are just smaller versions of what we're discussing with the energy storage systems. We can have a variety of consumer products from a single cell to multiple cells. And that's what these lithium ion batteries are. They're a series of cells. Something is not much bigger than a AA battery. An 18650 cell is used in a number of consumer products. And I think we have a video, but we find them in e-cigarettes, we find them in hoverboards. We also find these energy storage systems in vehicles, such as electrical cars, and also in airplanes and on trains. So we see them in all applications. Here we see a picture of a fire that happened or occurred in Nashville. And this was the result of a hoverboard where they experienced thermal runaway, which we'll get into a little bit later. But you can see the culprit here, this little hoverboard, and it just has 12 of these simple 18650 cells. But when one of these cells fails, now we're converting electrical energy into thermal energy. And that conversion can have an impact in fire safety. And as we advance forward, this small little cell here led to subsequent large fire loss in Nashville. So you see a $1 million loss here, which puts the occupant. And so UL's a safety company, and UL has the experience, or I should say, long history of being involved in electrical safety. So the Consumer Product Safety Commission starts to recognize when they see a series of failures. And they started recognizing these failures in hoverboards. And even this year, we had a hoverboard failure that led to the death of a 2-year-old in Pennsylvania and led to the death of a firefighter that was responding to that fire. So when you start to see multiple occurrences with the product, they contacted UL and asked for some assistance. So UL went out, purchased a series of hoverboards that you can typically find in the marketplace. And here we have it in one of the laboratories at UL in Northbrook, Illinois. And the manufacturer is explaining how this failure is going to occur, that you're going to hear some popping, you're going to see some smoke. The smoke will be under pressure, but that's how it's going to fail. We're using an external heating source because these batteries, once they reach a critical internal temperature, can start to go into this thermal runaway. But as you see, we're applying this heat to this hoverboard, and we have that pop, we have that cellular case failing, so we have the smoke. But as we start to advance through this video, you start to see the consequences of the failure of the individual cells, which then starts to propagate. And this isn't being just confined. At this point, the director of this laboratory, I think, was getting a little nervous, but you can start to see the electrolyte being projected across the room. So this has obvious consequences to that kid that may be playing in that room. The secondary combustibles that are in that room could be igniting. So if we respond and start to investigate, we start to see multiple ignition temp points. So we may be thinking arson, but also to a firefighter that may be responding where those cells start to fail in their path. So this isn't the only product we started to experience it. I think we have a video of a consumer product that failed, and they did a news report on it.
All right, let's go ahead and take a look at that.
So this is a simple one-cell e-cigarette. The clerk, you could see all of his buddies were really there for him in a time of need as he started running out of the store. But that was an e-cigarette that came to the marketplace, and it wasn't required to be tested or listed. So we saw a number of cases with these e-cigarettes where the user can simply trigger the cycle accidentally by being in their pocket, or they can have multiple batteries in their pocket that are rubbing together that start to short circuit. And once that battery casing fails, again, we're taking electrical energy, converting it to thermal energy, and it's under pressure. So we can hop a little bit forward. So when these incidents occur, UL can establish its test standards. And there are two ways to do this. You impanel very simple, I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself, but as you can see, this wasn't an isolated incident.
Right.
So we saw a number of incidents occurring, which then CPSC came to UL. We see some of the catastrophic injuries associated with these failures. And UL typically doesn't get involved in tobacco products. But here we see a failure of an e-cigarette that led to a vehicle fire on the right, and also a house fire down in Tacoma on the left. So this was no longer an issue evaluating the health risks of tobacco. It was a fire safety issue dealing with an electrical product. So UL got together, and they can do it one of two ways. They can establish a test standard through an ANSI-based process, where you impanel this technical panel with various interests, users, governmental agencies, manufacturers, enforcers, very similar to the NFPA process. And it goes through a consensus process to establish this test standard. We can also, in times of need or times of urgency, such as these hoverboards and e-cigarettes, you can start to open an outline of investigation. This allows UL to go ahead and engage the technical experts to look at the issue, whether it's the e-cigarette or it's the hoverboard, and start to establish or develop a test standard. Now the difference here, well, that test standard will then go through an ANSI process, but it allows us to cut that time down. So the manufacturers, the difference is the test standard can be adopted into codes, the outline of investigation can't. But the outline of investigation starts to establish the process responsible manufacturers need to follow to ensure that their product is safe. Again, it will develop into a test standard, but ironically, or I should say, interestingly enough, in both cases, UL established UL 8139, which is for e-cigarettes, and UL 2272 for hoverboards, and those were done in about 30 days, which is, if you've tried to change a standard in the NFPA, not to knock them, but any process, it takes a long time. So, but it gives that standard that the manufacturer has to start to meet. And I think we'll talk about it as that applies to the energy storage systems in a little bit.
And you mentioned overheating. That was one of the tests you showed us. But there's also an issue if the battery is damaged or punctured, and you did some testing in that area as well,
Absolutely.
Right?
There are a number of ways it can fail. It could be a defect in manufacturing, simply a speck of dust. but it's not always reliable that you're going to get immediate reaction. So we developed a test here. It's a puncture test. Simply, we're going to put a nail into that cell, which is then going to drive that cell into short circuiting, which is going to drive the internal temperature up, and then that battery casing is going to fail. And you can see the electrolytes burning tremendous. It's a tremendous amount of heat that's being created, and it's under pressure. This is the most reliable way to force it into runaway in a short time period, but we could see a manufacturing defect, something as simple as a speck of dust being on the membrane or the separator, an internal short circuit or damage. If you dent that battery, it may not happen right away, but it creates a friction point, which then starts to drive that internal temperature up, and then you get to that critical temperature where that battery just takes off.
Okay, so we know e-cigarettes, hoverboards, cell phones, as Paul pointed out. What are some other areas that our members here are going to encounter these energy storage systems and running these
You're going to
hazards?
see lithium ion technology isn't new. It's been in the marketplace 30, 40 years, Paul.
Yeah.
Like that. I want to say it's exploding in popularity now, but that would be a bad choice of words. But no, we're just seeing, we have 10,000 manufacturers in China that are bringing their products to the U.S. So we have manufacturers here in the U.S. So we're going to see them from cell phones to laptops to larger systems such as the electrical vehicle. We're seeing some manufacturers that actually, and these products do have a shelf life or an end life use, such as an electrical vehicle. Once that vehicle can no longer travel 250 miles on that battery, they look to replace that. Well, that battery still has energy, so that manufacturer or someone wants to now repurpose it into the marketplace. So we're seeing efforts to take car batteries, end of life, then repurpose it into residential settings. So it would replace your generator as a backup power system. Again, that's another way for us to develop a standard to make sure that it's safe.
Sure, and I keep saying we're going to run into new hazards and have to change our tactics and approaches. So Paul, what are some of the concerns? What are some of the issues we're going to see responding to these incidents?
Yeah, so there's not that much data out there, and we're collecting it now, but what we're looking at is we're finding that when these things do go up, right, there is some toxic, corrosive, and flammable gases. As you can see right there, that white smoke, you saw that in Sean's earlier one where he had that white smoke. That's indicative of this thing called thermal runaway. But that smoke right there is a flammable cocktail. That flammable cocktail is a concern for us. We're trying to figure out what the species are in there. We're realizing, we're assuming, because I don't want to go on record to say it is, but we're assuming that a lot of it is the hydrogen. And when hydrogen actually catches fire, when it reaches its ignition point, we could have a deflagration. And if you have a deflagration inside a building, that's a major concern for structural stability on that. So that's a big thing that we're looking at in my municipality, because the ultimate goal of this is to get these things inside of buildings, because in my area, we're just too congested to put them outside. So the goal is to get them inside the buildings right now.
Okay, well,
To that point, Jim, if I
sure,
just
no,
may
go
add,
ahead.
And that's some of our challenges too. As we know, there are 10,000 manufacturers, and this is electrochemical technology that has different properties per manufacturer. And this is the importance of research. We're still trying to figure out what's in that smoke, as Paul was talking about. What are the consequences of ignition? What are the consequences of confinement of that smoke and ventilation properties? So, we have to understand it in order to advise our members to respond properly.
You know, Sean, as you see that smoke, I'd rather see that thing on fire, consuming that flammable gas, than actually having that thing just sitting there waiting for the ignition temperature. So my thing is, if it's on fire, I feel a little bit safer with that. When it's not on fire, I'm concerned.
Yeah,
I'm concerned about that.
You mentioned the research, but that research also has to be translated into standards development and training for our members so they know how to deal with these issues. Now, both of you have mentioned thermal runaway, and we really haven't given a good explanation of that. Sean, why don't you take a stab at describing thermal runaway for us?
Sure. As I mentioned, there are a number of ways these batteries can start to fail. It can be a manufacturing defect, such as a simple piece of dust. It can be damage. When that damage occurs, it creates a friction point. Then internal temperature starts to drive, and when you start to get over 165 degrees F, you can start to lead to what we determine to be thermal runaway, where that internal temperature of that battery continues to increase. And as we know with the Firefighter Safety Research Institute's research, heat creates pressure. And so you're creating that internal pressure. And here, you start to see it. This is a residential energy storage system. You see that internal temperature starting to rise. You start to see the smoke. As that temperature rises, that pressure rises, and then that battery casing, that cellular casing, is going to fail. When that fails, now it can release the electrolytes that are inside. That pressure hopefully ignites instead of filling up that confined space with all this smoke. And then as that cell fails and burns, what does it do to the surrounding cells? Well, it starts to drive their internal temperatures up, and then you start to have propagation from cell to cell to cell to cell. And that's the challenge for us. We have a couple of methods or approaches that we can take right now. What we're trying to do is use as much water as you can deliver, because you want to keep the surrounding cells from propagating into this thermal runaway. And I think here in just 2 minutes, we're going to see actually how it transitions to flame. And this is a responsible manufacturer that is testing their product. And that's what we want. We want their manufacturers to test their product to failure, because you start to understand the critical points of failure. NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, has a saying, right? Everything will fail. So you test a failure, and then you engineer back. So we like to see this. We like to see a manufacturer sharing their information, their proprietary information with us, because now we can see what happens with this residential energy storage system. And to your point, Jim, also for a responding firefighter, when we were able to get in the code that these have to be in non-habitable spaces such as a garage. If you start to see strange fire behavior coming out of that garage, it should be telling you, hey, I've got something that I need to address. I've got something different here, and you may be having these energy storage systems. And I think Tony's going to talk about what will accompany these and give you an indication you may have these.
Sean,
go ahead.
I just want to add one thing. I mean, I think most firefighters are very visual learners, all right? So when they can see exactly how these things react, I think that's a good thing for us. And I tell the manufacturers, if you can just show us what happens when we get a critical fail, the firefighters just want to know if they can manage it or not. If they can manage it, then they're good to go, all right? They just need to see what it looks like. And as long as they can see it, then they can develop some sort of plan to handle it.
All right, and I get it. You want it to burn, right?
Yeah.
Because
Well,
then you know what you're dealing with. You mentioned using water
Right.
to extinguish it, but I know some use foam.
Yeah.
Well, what's the right way here?
So these things have been all around the country, all right? They've been in Canada, they're out in the United States. And the SDS sheets, or the safety data sheets that go with them, they're actually saying in that firefighter section, it says use foam, use appropriate extinguishing agent for this particular lithium ion battery. What is that? What is it? So there have been some people that have used foam. There was one incident where they actually called in the crash truck from the airport because this lithium ion storage system went up in flames. And the crash truck came in 3 hours they poured foam into it. He didn't put it out. So guess what they used? They wound up using water. And guess how it went out? It went out with the water because the water has a more cooling capacity than the foam. And the foam is also conductive. You still have that stored energy in there. And we're concerned about that stored energy coming back to the firefighter itself. So water, we feel, is the best thing. Not we feel. The tests have shown that water is the best thing to use in this particular.
What we're trying to do, sorry, Jim,
Yeah.
we're trying to cool those surrounding cells. Once that cell fails and it ignites, that electrolyte's going to burn. We've seen very limited success in extinguishing a cell fire, but it's been on a very small scale. When we scale it up, you're not going to put it out. So what we're trying to do is cool the surrounding cells and also hit the secondary combustibles that may be in the room, or like that residential system right there. If I see that coming out of the garage, as an incident commander, what I want to do is limit it there. I don't want that combustible wall to be engaged. I want to keep that fire there. and surround the cooling cells to hopefully limit it. And lithium ion is much different than lithium metal. And I think that's where maybe some confusion gets in there, that this is a hazmat experience or incident, and you go to the SDS, and as Paul was referring to, we've seen firefighters or incident commanders using the foam. It's not, we're not blaming them, right? Because we've got to get this information out. We've got to get this education out.
Well, Sean, that's funny, because I did speak to a couple of these guys that had these fires, and they said, well, why didn't you use water? They said, well, the SDS said, do not use water on this because of what you just mentioned about the lithium metal. So some people are thinking it's lithium, elemental lithium that's actually burning. It's actually a lithium salt. And we can use water. Matter of fact, we're telling you to use water in these applications.
We're trying to define it a little bit more besides copious.
Yeah, that makes sense. You briefly mentioned dangers after the fire is extinguished.
Yeah.
I want you to elaborate on that. I think we have a video showing some of that. Tell us about some of the dangers we're going to experience after the fire.
So I'm actually more concerned about post-fire events. In post-fire events, we know that these things have what they call reignition problems. Okay, so you can have a fire with these things, and sure enough, some people are calling them incomplete extinguishment. Whatever the terminology may be, these things can go back on fire. And that's important to understand that. You may not be able to, you may put this thing what you think is out, but it still has a deep-seated fire inside there that you may not be able to pick up with your thermal imaging camera. Matter of fact, you're probably not going to pick up with your thermal imaging camera. So you're going to actually leave the scene thinking that, okay, the fire's out and we're good to go. But that fire could reignite. We've seen that in an NFPA, they did a study on this. They did it with electric vehicles. And the electric vehicle, they put the fire out, and then almost a couple of days later, this thing reignited. So we know that these things could reignite anywhere from minutes to hours to possibly days later, which is a concern if you're putting these people back into a building where you just put those fires out. So if you're an incident commander and this is a dwelling, and you're saying, hey, we're going to allow you to go back into that building, and that thing reignites, you're kind of responsible for that.
Is that stranded energy? Is that?
Yeah, it is.
Similar?
It's that stranded energy is another thing that we have to worry about. Even when these things are burnt, and they could be burnt beyond recognition, you won't even be able to recognize that it's a battery. There still is a stored and stranded energy in there. And that stored or stranded energy could actually do some serious damage, if not kill a firefighter. Or we could have the firefighters just have a small little fire, and then sure enough, some of the components in there could cause an arc flash. And that's what we see on the screen now, is that arc flash taking place. So we really don't want firefighters to touch these things after a fire. Really, it shouldn't be handled by a firefighter.
And I think what you said about the thermal imager is critical, because we have to rely on technology in our profession, but we have to understand the limitations of that technology. That cell may have already failed, but you don't know it yet. It's not showing its outward signs. And we've seen vehicles reignite 21 days after an incident. So don't rely on that thermal imager. You know, understand that you're dealing with this hazard, as Paul was saying, that stranded energy, and we've got to get the expertise to that scene to start to deal with that battery or that battery system that's there.
And it goes back to your claim before about the copious amounts of water, a lot of water. Although you may see it out, there could be that deep-seated fire that still you haven't been able to get in, because some of these things are going to be inside of cabinets. And when they're inside of cabinets, you may not have good access in there to get the water in there. And that's going to be a problem. So just keep that in mind. You may even see them in containers. How are you going to get them inside the container? That's another challenge, which we'll talk about later.
And with that, Paul, so our natural reaction after we extinguish a fire is to overhaul it and make sure we get down to the deep sea of the fire. The difference with energy storage, it's that stranded energy that we have to worry about. So after you extinguish or you think it's extinguished, the one thing you don't want to do, as Paul mentioned, you don't want to take your metal tools and start pulling that apart. There's a lot of energy in there, or the potential for a lot of energy. And as you see with the arc flash in the last video, it's a pretty explosive flash, and that's this stranded energy coming out to you. And if you're that path to ground, you're going to receive that energy. So it's extremely dangerous. We don't want to be, poking tools into these and tearing this stuff apart.
I mentioned in the opening comments the widening gap between the amount of energy we have versus what we need. I mean, we think back when we were kids, there weren't all the demands on the household electricity there are today. I mean, maybe 1 or 2 TVs in the house. Now everyone has one in every room. Cell phone chargers are in every outlet in the house. So there's this increased demand. Are we seeing systems being put in place more and more? How widespread is it? Where are we going to see them?
First of all, 2 TVs when you were a kid?
Hey.
Is that a Prince George's thing? In Cleveland, we couldn't afford that. So,
I didn't say how we got them.
yeah, actually, Jimmy, I go back to attending the legislative conference the one year. When we were at the Ledge Conference, we were addressed by a representative. I think he was from Montana, but he was from out west, and he was, ironically enough, talking about renewable energy. And I remember him telling us very clearly that the problem with renewable energy in the United States was that it wasn't feasible for the energy storage systems or the battery technology that we have. That it wasn't, didn't make sense, and it wasn't, like I said, reasonable to start putting lead acid battery systems in people's homes. If we could solve that technology, that battery technology, he believed renewable energy will take off in the US. And I think the industry believes they have solved that technology, and it's these lithium ion batteries that can store an incredible amount of energy in a very small space, especially comparatively to a lead acid or some other type of battery system. And I've seen some reports that say in the next 5 years, regardless of where the politicians are, the industry is driving this, and you may see a 500% increase in photovoltaic systems and renewable energy systems in the marketplace in North America.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. Just driving in my neighborhood, it seems like a new house every day. We're seeing solar panels on the roof. So let me jump over to you, Tony. PV systems, solar panels, all of the challenges that Sean and Paul have brought up in our earlier discussion, are they similar in PV systems?
That's a great point, Jim. So with PV systems, or photovoltaics is the industry name for them, along the lines of the challenges, it all comes down to that electrical energy. So with PV, unlike an energy storage system, a photovoltaic module does not store energy. It creates energy as the sun or light hits it. So it's just there for use as you need it. Once you cover it up, that energy goes away. So that's not an energy storage device. One of the challenges that comes up a lot of times in a lot of the classes that we teach, people are wondering, so how do we fight a fire with PV? What do we use to put it out? A lot of the firefighters will come back and tell us we're just going to sit back and let it burn. We're not sure what to put on it. It's a Class C fire, energized electrical fire. So with that, water is usually not our best choice. But as you heard with Paul, the energy storage systems, they're saying large amounts of water for energy storage. For PV fires, we're going to utilize water. So in 2010, UL received a grant to study the firefighter operations with PV on buildings. They released this study in 2011, and with that study, they come up with some recommendations. And I believe we have a video that'll explain the recommendations.
Yeah, let's go to that video, and I think there's audio with this one as well.
So firefighters have had questions about how operationally to fight fires on buildings with energized PV systems. UL in 2010 received a grant from the Assistance of Firefighter Grant Program to study just that. The first test was the shock hazard due to the presence of water in PV systems during suppression. UL conducted several tests using 2 different kinds of nozzles, a smoothbore nozzle and fog stream nozzle, and several different water sources: municipal water, pond water, and salt water. They directed a hose stream at a copper plate that was energized up to 1,000 volts and moved the nozzle closer and further apart to see at what point back on the coupling current was detected. What we found was that with a smooth bore, a 1-inch nozzle, 21 psi nozzle pressure, when 1,000 volts was on that plate, 5.7 milliamps was detected back at the coupling. When we went below 600 volts, that amount of current was lower than the perceptible level. 20 feet away, and there was no perceptible current at even 1,000 volts. So if you're only using a smoothbore nozzle, the recommendation is to maintain at least 20 feet away for up to 1,000 volts. However, as most apartments do have combination nozzles, once the nozzle pattern was open to at least 10 degrees, the tests found that you could get less than 5 feet away from 1,000 volts. This was very helpful information for firefighters to understand how close they can actually get to an energized PV system and attempt to knock down the fire.
So clearly the research shows that that's a safe way to put out these fires. And I want to point out that video was actually narrated by Matt Pace. He's an IFF member out of San Jose, California, and that's part of our online learning modules that are available through the IFF. I mentioned it in my introductory comments that we have online training. And Tony, I know you're part of the cadre that's been going out around North America teaching some of these in-person training classes. Tell the audience a little bit about your experience in delivering the in-person training.
Yep, sure. Well, I'd like to go back to that video. Just, you see in the 1,000 volt mark that they used. The reason they used 1,000 volts, that's the maximum that will be exposed to in the PV world by, regulated by the NEC. So 1,000 volts would be for a commercial structure, and 600 volts, and that's DC, for residential structures. So up to 600 for residential. So there's a lot of energy that's in these systems. But you know, as Jim said, we've been traveling around the country teaching this program, and we go out there, and what we like to do is we start out with the basics, you know, the identification of a PV system. And with that, the first arriving units, officers or person that's sitting in the passenger seat, the easiest way they're gonna be able to identify a system is actually seeing the modules on the roof, as you see in this picture here. So you can either see the modules on the roof, maybe located on the property, or as with a commercial building, it might be a little bit tougher because they're up above the parapets and you can't see those. So with that, we also like to teach everybody the solar components. Let's take a look at the components, let's know what they look like, be able to recognize the components if you can't see the modules or the array up on a roof. So some of those components are inverters, disconnects, conduits, you know, that kind of stuff. And prior to 2011, there wasn't a requirement for any labeling on this stuff. So in 2011, the NEC added into the article, the 690 article, a section on labeling. And with that, it's a standard label. It's a red background label, reflective, with white lettering. And as you see where the arrow's pointed to on that inverter there, and you notice all the red labeling on all the devices, the conduits, the inverters, the disconnects, that's a good indication that's part of a PV system. So if you show up on scene and you see that, that'll give you that first identification of, hey, there's a PV system here, and I just need to look and find out where the array or the modules are.
And
Tony, just to Tony's point, that just highlights the importance of that 360 and a full size up. Absolutely. As you approach that structure fire.
And with any new technology, it typically outpaces our ability to develop the codes and standards that are going to not only protect us, but protect the public we serve. Where are we relative to PV systems and codes and standards in protecting our members?
Yeah, so they added into the code in 2014, they added another a word called rapid shutdown.
What's rapid shutdown?
So rapid shutdown to us, in the fire service, we think rapid being fast and shutdown going to a zero state. With rapid shutdown, that's not necessarily the case. It's rapid, but the rapid being 30 seconds, and shut down is to a limited state. So 30 volts DC within 30 seconds. That's what the code states rapid shutdown is. 30 volts being that touch safe. You notice in this one, there's a label that says it's equipped with a rapid shutdown. That's some of the labels that you'll currently see now. When we go into the 14 code and in the 17 code, this is a label that they put out for the rapid shutdown. So you notice it's the red and white background, and this will indicate that the system has a rapid shutdown with it to the 2014 code. What that means for us is if you look at the array on the right side of the house there, it has a 10-foot boundary around the array. So within that 10-foot boundary, the voltages remain at the full level of the array. So up to that 600 volts for residential and up to 1,000 for commercial. On the interior, it shows the 5-foot boundary. So anywhere from the array to 5 feet, that will still be full potential energy. This is the 2014. In 2017, they did a little bit of adapting to the code, and they came up with a new sticker. The reason they came up with a new sticker, there's a difference between the 14 code and the 17 code. You'll notice this is yellow, got a yellow and a white background. Where the differences come in here is the boundaries changed. So that 10-foot boundary that we had, that drops down to 1 foot. So it made it a little bit safer for us. The interior boundary dropped down to 3 feet. The other difference with this, and be able to distinguish between the 2014 and the 17, 14 was pretty cut and dry, and it said, here's our boundaries, this is what the installer has to do. In 2017, the installers, they give the installers 3 options. So 3 options being to comply with 2017 rapid shutdown. 1, that it's either field listed and labeled. 2, the system needs to drop the array down to within 80 volts to 30 seconds, and that's within the boundaries. Or 3 is no metallic parts within a certain distance away from there. What the fire service and the IFF, our push is option 2, the 80 volts. If they're not gonna drop it down to the touch safe, at least get to that 80 volts. That's what we'd like to see happen. The other thing that they did is they pushed off the initiation date of that section of the code until January 1st of 2019. So the installers have till that time to comply, and start using that 17 regulation.
And we at the IFF, we're continuing to ramp up our efforts on codes and standards development. And the members, you guys at the last IFF convention actually allocated more per capita to have more representatives serve on those committees. And I know, Paul, you serve on the technical committee for energy storage systems for the IFF. Where are we in respect to those developments?
Well, yeah, I serve on that committee with a couple of firefighters. Matt Pace, as you mentioned before, is on that committee. Rich Sluick, who is a battalion chief in the FDNY, and Chris Towski, who is from Cambridge. So it's good to have those firefighters on there. That new one that's coming out for installation is NFPA 855. It's only in its draft mode yet. There are some editorial things that need to take place. So I don't want to speak too much about it, but you know what's good is that the firefighters that are on that committee, we are really driving safety, and that's a very, very good thing for you. We, the manufacturers and the committee members are listening to what we have to say. We're trying to really make it simple for you. We're trying to make it safer for you. And we have a voice in there, which is a really, really good thing for us. When the IFF actually putting people into those positions helps so much for the safety of the firefighter.
Yeah, we can't let industry drive it. We have to be involved in the conversation. Sean, what's UL doing?
Well, UL has a couple of test standards that apply to this. UL 1973 deals with the cell, whereas UL 9540 starts to deal with the system. But the challenge was, especially as we scale it up, you get this phone call from some unnamed individual in New York that says they have 500 applications for these energy storage systems. What do we do about it? And the code was pretty much silent. And it was always viewed as an electrical issue, right? So we started looking at it, and I'll talk about the code aspect in a second. But UL, well, let me go with the code. We had a multi-pronged approach. Myself, Paul, Matt Pace was involved, Andy was involved in NFPA 1, getting this in there. Howard Hopper from UL led a multidisciplined group to start to address how do we address this in the fire code. What are some of the limitations, because there were no limitations, and they did. We came up in a very short period of time with some regulations limiting to 50 kilowatt hours in a battery unit. With the exception, you can go to 250 kilowatt hours if you put it under a full-scale fire test. Well, what is the full-scale fire test? And that's what UL is working on, and they're engaged. Paul's involved, other stakeholders are involved, manufacturers are involved, Sandia, National Laboratory is involved, to develop a fire test standard for these full-scale systems. So we can actually start to, how are they going to fail, the installation with NFPA 855, and then the testing requirements to make sure that we're having responsible manufacturers put in responsible systems. And what we're finding out of these tests is we have a lot more work to do.
Yeah, but I think that's key. You're saying what you're finding out from these tests. So we're not just throwing things into the standard because we
Exactly.
think it's the right thing to do. It's all evidence-based. And
Right.
that's how we're going to make the biggest change. All right, I think we still have some time available for questions from our audience here on site. If you would, please just go to the microphone, tell us who you are, where you're from, and ask your question. But I'm going to throw out one just from a high level. Tony. Sean mentioned a 500% increase in the number of PV systems. Where's PV going? What do we need to be aware of?
Well, with the PV, it's, as he said, the increases, the 500%, it's there, it's been around for a long time. The installers are installing this stuff nationwide. The codes, sometimes the technology gets ahead of our codes. So we're continuing to work on different groups and different panels to stay with this. And as you can see in 2011, 14, and the 17 code, we're adding stuff into the code to make it better for us. You know, we'd like to tell the fire service just to, you know, sit back, we're working on it. The future codes that are coming out are getting better for us. We have a hand in this, and the voices that we have on the panels, we're trying to make things safer for our members across the countries.
Perfect. All right, do we have any questions from the audience now?
While we're waiting for someone, just to follow up on there, the new systems, Tony, if you can just elaborate for a little bit of a second, aren't necessarily going to traditionally look like that picture you had put up. We're going to see the BIPV systems, right, that are going to be a little bit more difficult to identify.
Right, so as Sean's saying, the building integrated PV. So what that is, it's built into the shingles of a roof. There's a couple companies out there that have designed systems that are utilizing almost 100% of your roof space. So they're going from left to right, you know, ridge to gutter. They're using 100% of that roof space, multiple different angles. And with these systems, you know, the other system, the modules, you can see them. With the shingles, it's built into the shingles of a structure. So it's a little tougher to see, and the technology is getting better, and there's different places that the voltages are in those systems. They're not completely up and running, and their technology is still going now. So there's still little tweaks that they're working on, and we're trying to get that information from them as the technology improves.
Yeah, but we do have manufacturers that are selling them.
Yeah, there is manufacturers out there selling them now, and with those, you just have to be aware the identification's a little bit tougher to identify the shingles versus a set of modules on a roof.
All right, let's go to our first question.
Hi, my name is Paul Mannix. I'm with Local 854, where we're lucky to have Paul Rogers as a fellow member. This is very counterintuitive, a lot of it, the use of the water. And like you pointed out, you'll have to not let firefighters then overhaul with metal tools or with any kind of tool because of the stranded storage that's still in there. Looking at the solar panels, you know, the technical aspects are very important, but we can't forget the basics. And as you talked about the training and the codes going forward, especially in a private dwelling, when you're putting added weight on the roof of an old building or a new building with lightweight construction, and if we're going to have an array of the energy storage systems, the batteries, within the house somewhere, will the codes be updated to address the added weight if there's going to be a lot of weight? I don't know how many are going to be in a private dwelling, but you could have a situation like the bathroom, which is usually the smallest room in the house, but it's got the highest concentration of weight because of the bathtub, the fixtures. So will that be part of the training and the code issuance and rewriting going forward?
Yeah, so with the added weight, we do touch upon it in our training programs. So the added weight of a PV system is around 3 pounds per square foot. To put that in a little bit of perspective, if you had a shingled roof and you chose to re-roof your shingles, you're adding about 4 pounds per square foot to your roof. So the weight of a PV system is a little bit less than re-roofing one layer of shingles. Yes, it does add some weight. The places where you need to be concerned are lightweight truss, that collapse time that might cut that down a little bit for us, but we're not adding a huge amount of weight to the roof, and when they do come in for the installation, they will check out your roof rafters and check out your roof and see if it's going to support that weight. Same with commercial buildings. A commercial building, you're adding a lot more weight because some of them are just held down with cinder blocks or concrete pavers. They're not penetrated into the roof. So there's a lot more weight that's added to there, but they do look at the engineering aspect of the structure to make sure it will withstand that weight. But those are things that everybody's keeping a tab on as the industry proceeds with their technology.
Jim, something Brother Mannix just mentioned about the tools, it just brings to my mind how our members want to solve that situation. They want to bring it to a close. We're doers. And these energy storage systems with distributed energy, they have increased risk, but we also can't evaluate where that internal cell is at. And I want to kind of compare it to mattress fires. And when we see these systems on upper floors, it's similar to taking, hey, I think I extinguished that mattress fire, I'm going to take that mattress into an elevator and get it out of this building. You could potentially take one of these modules into that elevator, and you can't predict when that cell is going to fail. So sometimes we have to realize our own limitations, and we have to call the experts in. And this is a challenge for all of us, right? So it requires us to be involved in the process.
Yeah, Sean, we're looking at that in New York City if these things do get into the buildings. Right now, they're not inside the buildings yet. Okay, we're waiting for better guidance from UL and the NFPA. But if they do get in, they need to have some sort of decommissioning plan. What happens if they go on fire? Who's going to take them out? Who's responsible for that? So all these questions are still out there that still need to be addressed, and it is a concern. Yeah.
It's good that, like you mentioned earlier, we've got the fire service engaged with manufacturers, and that's what we want. We've got some responsible manufacturers that are engaging us, and that's a positive sign.
Yeah. We have another question from the audience. Gary?
Hi, my name is Gary Rainey, Metro Dade Firefighters, Miami, Florida. I was wondering if you could comment or maybe give a little guidance on, since the integral PV panels now are starting to show up on roofs, and Tesla's have just announced they're going to be selling them, which will probably make it a mass market item, that if the fire doesn't involve the PV panel, what kind of risk is there to the firefighter during roof ventilation using power tools or axes or things like that through a roof that has an integral PV panels throughout?
Okay, so what you're asking is if we need to ventilate the roof, being able to cut through the panels.
Yeah, and the panels themselves aren't the problem, not the house, the fires in the kitchen or something.
Yeah, so with Tesla's new roof, there was a little conference and they talked about some of the aspects or the key points of their roof. They built this in a way, they're saying that you're able to remove the panels out of the way. It's a pretty like a quick disconnect. It's a pretty neat roofing system. So with some of the other companies, they remove the layers of shingles and they put this shingle right over the plywood. So we don't recommend cutting through any of that. So you have to change your tactics a little bit. You might have to go to the gable ends, and that topside vertical vent is probably going to be off limits. With that newer roof, until they do their research, they're going to build a building. They're going to bring firefighters out there. They're going to start working on how to remove the panels, what you can do to cut through them. But we're not recommending or telling anybody to cut through any modules, cut through any panels because of that energy that's in them. So that's where your tactics are going to have to change a little bit until there's more data from these companies and we know that it's safe to cut through their modules. Also, what we're dealing with is we're dealing with a glass type of material, and it's pretty strong. So going up there with a chainsaw, that's not going to do it. So we'll see what they come up with after their study.
Just to follow up on that, sorry, Tone. Tesla said they've brought the technology that'll bring that down to 6 volts. So it makes it safer for our members. But I'll just give a plug to the research that we've been doing with UL and NIST, right? We have horizontal and vertical ventilation studies, and that give us options. And you don't have to be on that roof. And again, it's about educating ourselves and what our tactical options are on the fire ground.
And with the lower voltage with that roof, there's still a high voltage section to that roof. And as of right now, nobody knows exactly where, as far as the fire service goes, where that section's going to be. There's not a marking system on that roof yet.
You said it perfectly, Sean. Education is going to be the key. We do have the IFF online course that we developed in partnership with IREC, so I encourage all of you to go take that course. It's available to anyone online, members, non-members, it doesn't matter. We want you to get the training so that you're safe out there. Paul, I mentioned that you helped develop an NFPA course. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is the first of its kind, from what I understand. This is an online course that the NFPA had got a grant to put together, and it gets into the different things that we kind of discussed here today. It's kind of an interactive thing. I went on it. I helped develop it. Along Matt Pace actually was involved in that. So I recommend that you go to. There's the website right there. Give it a shot. You may learn some good stuff out of it. You get some good things out of that.
Critically important. One last question before we go.
Right. Glenn Paley, Local 953, Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada. My question is about codes and government regulations. Just wondering if they have created or they are in the process of creating any codes, government regulations regarding installation and design of these systems.
Yeah, we actually, thank you, Glenn. We got active very quickly as these systems were coming in. And again, our participation in the codes, we were able to put some maximum allowable quantities. So we're saying that a battery unit can be up to 50 kilowatt hours, but it gives the exception. You can go up to 250 kilowatt hours within the fire code with the 3-foot separation, with the theory being it won't propagate from unit to unit to unit. And also with the 1-hour fire separation within the room itself. You can go up to 600 kilowatt hours within that battery, or I should say that occupancy. But we're going to have a lot more challenges. In the residential market, we got it in non-habitable spaces, which other countries like Australia and New Zealand, they're finding these batteries in the basement of homes. They're finding it underneath steps, and all of a sudden they're making entry and bam. But it's only with that involvement in the codes, and not just at the national level, but at that local level, you got to be aware of what are the restrictions, what are the requirements, and it's continuously to develop because we're doing the research and we're finding out new things and we're bringing that into the regulation aspect.
And not leaving it to industry, having our subject matter experts.
Well, we're
have a
engaging with
direct
industry,
impact.
right?
Exactly.
And I think for the most part, Paul and Tony, with your experiences with industry, the responsible manufacturers really enjoy that engagement and appreciate that engagement.
Absolutely. They've been good.
Yeah.
Some of them have been very, very good.
Yes.
Well, look, there's a lot more that we could talk about, extensive information. I really appreciate everything you've brought to the table today. For those that watched via the live stream, if you have a question that you want answered, simply email us at safety@iff.org, and I'll make sure we get the answer back to you. For those here in the audience, appreciate you hanging in for the last session of this year's conference. Safe travels home, and be safe. Thank you.